They're using the law to target one individual. They've brought America down to the level of Pakistan and Putin's Russia. Hello everyone, welcome to the Steve Hilton Show. I am in New York this week, taping from my hotel bedroom, and enjoying it very much here. I've been doing some of the Fox News shows here in New York, and I was here at the time of the trial that's going on, of course, and so that was very vividly reported here in New York especially. I was here the day of the Stormy Daniels testimony, the first day of that. I don't want to get into all the salacious aspects of that, but I do want to use the salacious aspects of all of that to make a point that is so evident now. You listen to any legal expert talking about that day in particular, that day of the trial, and they all made exactly the same point, which is this. It's all irrelevant to the case. The case, such as it exists, is to do with business records and falsification of business records to influence an election and some combination of false accounting, breaking accounting rules in order to commit another crime, which was about political donations. What's Stormy Daniels got to do with any of that? Nothing. Nothing at all. If they'd have asked the question, I don't know if they did, what do you think of the record keeping at the Trump organization? She wouldn't have a clue. Nothing to do with her at all. Why then did they bring her into the case? Only one reason: to get the media attention and to destroy and degrade Donald Trump in the eyes of the public. In other words, what they achieved with the Stormy Daniels day in court is to prove Trump's point, to prove what he's been saying all along, that this is entirely political. It is election interference. And the Stormy Daniels day proved that beyond any reasonable doubt. And let's remember the origin of this case. Again, even calling it a case seems like a stretch. This was brought by a politician, an elected politician, a far-left Democrat, one of the Soros far-left DAs, like we have in California, George Gascon, who hopefully will be out in this year's election. We've had his rival, Nathan Hochman, on our show, fantastic qualified candidate who we hope will replace George Gascon. Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, kicked out on a recall. In Oakland, Pamela Price, another one. They're trying to remove her in a recall because it's such a disaster in Oakland. She's now challenging that legally, trying to cling to life. Right across the country, these far-left politicians elected to the position of DA and then using it mainly to destroy the quality of life in their jurisdictions with their pro-crime policies. Here in New York, Alvin Bragg actually used that position to try and get involved in national politics. Why? Because he said he would. It was part of his election campaign, just as it was with Letitia James, the New York State Attorney General. Both of them ran for office on a very clear promise. We will get Trump. We will use the judicial system over which we preside to target one particular individual for political reasons. That is not just wrong, it is a terrifying corruption of the American judicial system and our rule of law. It is terrifying. And if you want to see one thing that captures just how terrifying it is, it was the statement of Kathy Hochul that barely got any attention, the governor of New York, when in their Letitia James case, which was all about false accounting and inflating the value of property assets and all the rest of it, things to do with Trump's property portfolio. And yet a lot of people across the country, business people, saying this is going to be a disaster for New York's reputation as a business center. Because actually, if everyone's now going to be prosecuted for those kinds of things, which, again, expert commentators said this is just normal part of business. Trump didn't do anything different to what every other business does in his sector. And so this is really frightening, and it will put people off from investing in New York, from doing business in New York. And there's a lot of commentary like that. So guess what the governor comes out and says, no need to worry. I have a very clear message for the business community. No need to worry. This is not New York turning on business. This is just about one man, Donald Trump. I mean, there you are. Again, it proves the point that they're using the law to target one individual. It is just completely outrageous. It is total corruption of our system. It is utterly unacceptable. And just to give you a sense of how extreme this is, I guess with the way that the Democrats and the media have been reacting to Trump over the years, we've gotten used to the craziness, to the extremism that they use when they talk about him, the threat to democracy, and he's going to end democracy, and this will be the last free elections you'll ever have. I mean, they say these things as a matter of course. So maybe we've kind of got used to it. This is really frightening. And to give you a sense of how bad it is, just in the last few months, just within the last year, where are the other places, high-profile places, that this has gone on, where politicians have abused the judicial system, the legal system, to target their political opponents? Pakistan, where the government went after Imran Khan to try and stop him becoming president and stop his party being elected. Vladimir Putin, the great evil force, according to the Democrats, he did this. He used the legal system in Russia to take one of his rivals off the ballot in the recent presidential election. So that is the company that they now have put America in. These people that endlessly lecture us about our democracy and the rule of law. They've brought America down to the level of Pakistan and Putin's Russia. That's what we learned from what happened in court here in New York this week. All right, for our policy conversation this week, I want to play you a clip from a recent episode that we taped for my new show, Big Ideas Book Club. And the book, as it were, that we featured on this episode, a little bit of a cheat. It's actually a policy report, but I'm very proud of it. Golden Together, my California policy organization, was part of this report, which looked at the outcomes for Latinos in California compared to Latinos in other states with different policy regimes, in particular Florida and Texas, on a number of different measures, education and jobs and incomes and home ownership. The report was called El Futuro es Latino, produced with Chapman University. It's very, very good, really worth checking out. You can read it at goldentogether.com. But this part of the conversation, particularly interesting, it is about the carbon economy and how central that is actually to opportunity for working class Latinos in particular. And of course, that's directly under attack from the Democrats. So take a listen.
Well, one angle that we looked at was just demographically, what employment opportunities do Latinos occupy in the state? And we found that they are heavily overrepresented in agriculture, manufacturing, logistics, and construction. So we call these carbon economy jobs, carbon producing jobs. So Latinos are the carbon economy in California. And so you find that their future, their economic future, is very vulnerable in the state because California is at war with the carbon economy. They want to set, greenhouse emissions down to zero. So if they go down that path, if everything stays the same, Latinos will not have a future in the state. So, when we look at, agricultural workers, 90% are Latino. More than 50% of the state's construction workers, Latino. So what you see is that this is the carbon economy. And, if everything stays the same, there's very few jobs that will be available. We even took a look at trucking sort of as a case study, because this is a very upwardly mobile job. There's low barriers to entry. You can do well and you can own your trucks, you can start running rigs and scale up a business. So when you look at the California plan put out by the California Air Resources Board, CARB, basically they want to eliminate all gas-powered, diesel-powered trucks at all California ports. And so that really means that this industry is going to really disrupt some of the entry-level work because it's so expensive to buy an electric-powered truck. It's something like $400,000. So it's increasing barriers to entry. And unfortunately, these upwardly mobile jobs for Latinos, who represent more than 50% of California's trucking industry, they're largely going to be impacted by this.
Joel, you're right. I mean, it's a brilliant term, the carbon economy, because it captures It's so important for Latinos, and they are, as Soldier said, they're at war. They'd like to shut it all down. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, I was just looking at it from a report we just did at Golden Together on the business climate in California. You look at agriculture, just to take that, one of the ones that you rightly mentioned, Sol. I mean, they're with water, right? That's another aspect of it. They are directly they're putting in place regulation that will directly take out of production at least 1 million acres of agricultural land. It's just destroyed for just because of ideology. It's completely amazing. Joel, to pick up on all of that, the carbon economy story, I think it's so interesting.
Well, I mean, I think basically what you have is you have this idea that if anything you do here in California is going to be a role model, the rest of the world is going to immediately adopt. I think when you look at an economy right now as the highest unemployment just about in the country, slow job growth. When we take a look at job growth, at the most recent numbers, almost all the job growth is government jobs and medical jobs. We're not growing manufacturing jobs. We're not growing construction jobs. We're not growing uh, all the type of carbon economy jobs that Soledad was mentioning. And so when you put this idea that we're going to create this ideal and everyone will want to go to it, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that people in Florida and Texas are going to look at California policy and, oh yeah, we'd like to have high housing prices and dysfunctional schools and crappy jobs. That's really what we want. I mean, I thought it was sort of funny recently when Newsom said, "Well, I'm going to Trump-proof California," and I think the rest of the country may be asking, "Can we California-proof the rest of the country?" I mean, it's really, you know, and they live in this ideational universe which has very little connection to reality. And of course, they're greatly helped with the fact that, with a few exceptions, the vast majority of the media is on the same side and is going to play the same tune. But am concerned about what the future of the next generation in California. I do have two daughters. I have a somewhat of a stake. I'd like them to come back and live here, and they can't. I don't think they're going to likely do it under the current circumstances.
All right, joining us for California Corner, it's Susan Shelley. Susan, it's a big day for you because of what you've been working on, but actually for all of us in California, anyone who pays taxes, who might pay taxes, or anything related to taxes, because it's this topic we've talked about many, many times, the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act, a ballot initiative, which your organization, Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, has been very much at the heart of getting it on the ballot, along with the Business Roundtable, that will protect taxpayers, as the name suggests, from the abuses that have been going on. We have the highest taxes in America, along with some of the worst services, the worst poverty. We've talked about that many times. But why was today important? By the way, I should point out, we're taping this. Listeners may be hearing at different times. We're taping it on Wednesday, May the 8th. I'm in New York, actually. You're in California watching what's going on. What's the news today?
Well, today was the day that the Supreme Court of California heard oral arguments in the governor's lawsuit. The legislature and the governor are suing to have this taken off the ballot before voters have the opportunity to vote on it. The defenders of democracy are very not fond of
I know.
democracy when when the people of California might actually contradict them. So what's going on here is the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act is on the November ballot. It's received 1.4 million signatures, and it is on the November ballot, and the government is suing to have it taken off the ballot. Today they heard the oral arguments, and essentially the governor's argument is the voters are just too stupid to be involved in taxation. And the people who decide taxation should be the people who decide how much is needed instead of the people who actually pay the taxes. The people who pay the taxes are irrelevant, not qualified, should not be involved. That's just too dramatic a change, and it can't be allowed on the ballot. That's their argument.
What are they? I mean, it's a constitutional argument they're making, right? They're trying to find what is it in the, and this is California law we're talking about. It's the California Supreme Court. What is there in the California Constitution which provides for ballot initiatives in the manner that you followed in this case? I believe, is the ballot initiative statute back to 1911? Am I getting that right?
Yes, the direct democracy power of initiative is from 1911. And before that, The original Constitution sets out the amendment process, and then it also says if you're going to completely revise the Constitution, then the legislature has to call a constitutional convention. So, what the governor and the legislature are trying to argue is that the Taxpayer Protection Act is a revision of the Constitution. It's just too much and can't be done through an amendment through the initiative process. This is a very sketchy argument because what the Taxpayer Protection Act is doing is restoring what's already in the Constitution and which the courts and the legislature have interpreted out of it. So it's very sketchy to argue that it's a revision of the Constitution when what you're doing is essentially putting back what is in the Constitution.
But wait, they're constantly revising the Constitution. I mean, didn't they revise the Constitution through ballot initiative themselves?
Well, it depends on the definition of revise is kind of where this stands. You can amend it, that's a change. The degree of amendment, I guess, whether you're making a structural change to the government. Now, one thing that the Taxpayer Protection Act does is create for the first time voter approval of state taxes. So instead of the legislature and the governor raising taxes, once they agree on a tax increase, it has to go to the voters. Now, is that a substantial revision of the form of government in California? Or is it just one more argument in a long-running war over whether it will or will not be easier to raise taxes?
Is that a provision in the Taxpayer Protection Act just for
Yes.
raising taxes or any change to taxes? And is it any tax rate? Is it the overall tax burden? How is that all interpreted?
Well, I suppose it could be interpreted different ways. I'm not an attorney, but generally speaking, what it says is a tax increase passed by the legislature and signed by the governor must go on the ballot for voter approval. Any tax increase.
So if, for example, I don't know, for the sake of argument, you want to abolish all income taxes, corporate and personal, in California, and instead put it all on property taxes, but the overall level of taxation because of the amount collected was the same, but that would obviously mean an increase in what would that count?
I think it would if they were to propose something like that. It would, if the legislature, under the Taxpayer Protection Act, if they raise property taxes, that would have to go on the ballot. Would have to go on the ballot anyway because the property tax rate is in the Constitution. But this is more along the lines of they want to put a tax on firearms, so they want to raise the income tax or something like that, and they want to do it with legislation. That legislation would then have to go on the ballot for voter approval. For instance, the gas tax increase from a few years ago would have had to go on the ballot.
I mean, this is what they do the whole time. I mean, that's why they hate this,
Right.
And that's why we have the highest taxes. They tax without limit. There's no constraint, and you have a supermajority in the legislature. I mean, so they're saying that it's too big of a change. How were those arguments received?
Well, it's difficult to tell from the questions. One of the fundamental questions is whether the Supreme Court has to decide this before the election, because they can sort of freeze it. And they can say this won't be implemented until, if it's passed by the voters, this won't be implemented until we review it afterwards. And then there's a severability clause in the measure which says if any one portion is found unconstitutional, the rest still stands. So all of this would have to be haggled after the election, potentially, if they were to freeze it now. What the government is arguing is they just want the thing off the ballot. They don't want anybody to be able to vote on it. They don't want to discuss it any further. I think that's really a very anti-democratic argument.
Of course. It's so interesting that I mean, it really is so transparent now, this argument of that. And I've been saying it for years, when they talk about our democracy, they mean their power. I've said that as a kind of line in scripts and in speeches and so on for years, but it's becoming more and more evident that is exactly what is going on. You see it in this case. You see it in their lawsuit against Huntington Beach. The voters passed voter ID. Next, almost like night follows day, in they come with a lawsuit to overturn what the voters decided.
That's
I mean,
right.
it's just on and on.
And just to add insult to injury, they hire outside law firms to do this, and then the taxpayers have to pay for the lawyers to sue themselves.
It's a little bit like I just saw that there was a hearing in the legislature. We're going to get to homelessness in a minute because there's some crazy new homelessness tax in LA that you're going to tell us about. But there was a hearing on the $24 billion that's spent on homeless. That story the other day, the audit report. No one has any clue about where the money went, and they had the person who's running the unit, whatever it's called, within Sacramento, some extra bit of bureaucracy that's supposed to be tracking the money. And this person was before the legislature and honestly had the nerve to ask for more money in order to track the money that's already been spent.
It's burlesque. It's beyond comedy. It's so broad, it's burlesque.
I know. So look, it feels like actually the thing that I also find is so interesting about this story is because we're very familiar with the Supreme Court at the national level. Most people who follow politics know the names of many of the Supreme Court justices. We can cite cases. It's really part of the political conversation. The California Supreme Court is not. I mean, I couldn't name a single one of the just. I couldn't even tell you how many are there. I mean, how many are there?
There are 7. And if they decide that the voters cannot vote on the Taxpayer Protection Act, a duly qualified initiative that 1.4 million voters signed to put on the ballot, if they decide the voters are not allowed to vote on that, I promise you're going to know their names.
And do we know if they have are we able to say of these 7, there's, as they describe at the national level, conservative justices, liberal justices? Are there any conservative justices? Are they all liberal? It's been a one-party state for a long time.
It has been a one-party state for a long time. To my knowledge, they are all liberal. But this is a very difficult question, I think, whether they're going to curtail the power of direct democracy, which, as you said, dates to 1911, whether they're going to curtail it by pulling something off the ballot before the election.
Yeah.
That's a very big step to take.
It's very big. I mean, it feels like generally, you see this with the Supreme Court, they try and have minimum, especially with John Roberts, for example, as the Chief Justice, has this philosophy, it seems, to try and avoid doing really aggressive, put things that would put the court in the middle of what they would consider to be a political process, and try and find a way through. Feels like that option here would be to do what you've just said, which is allow it to stay on the ballot, see what the voters actually decide, and then try and sort it out.
That would be the historically consistent way to do it. If something is qualified for the ballot under the Constitution, if it's unconstitutional, it is reviewed after it's passed. If they think it's unconstitutional, they can challenge it after it's passed. And then it's severable. The different portions of it would have to be considered separately.
But they're actively, their lawsuit requests that it be removed.
Right.
It is amazing.
It's terribly aggressive, and essentially what they're arguing is that the voters, this is what the lawyers said for the government, the voters do not have the capacity to make these decisions. Oh, really?
But that's not an argument of law. I mean, that's an argument that's an opinion. It's a classic sort of left-wing opinion that you can't trust the people. You have to have experts and the politicians decide things. That's a very deep philosophical divide between right and left.
And arguing that the people who pay the taxes should have no input into what the taxes are because they don't have the capacity to understand. Really? So the government can just decide how much it needs and take it, and the voters have nothing to say about that. And they think that that is a Republican form of government. Well, I don't know if that is or not.
What do we expect in terms of the timing?
June 27th is the deadline date that the Secretary of State said she needs to know whether it is or is not on the ballot. So before June 27th, we can expect a decision.
That's going to be a big day. Very interesting. Okay. Now, a sort of exemplar of this is happening live right in front of our eyes in Los Angeles. I touched on it earlier, the homelessness. It's another homelessness tax. I mean, I do have a slight amount of sympathy for, I guess, that poor official who was floundering and saying, I can't keep track of all the money. I think normal people, we can't keep track of all the homeless initiatives. I mean, almost every week something pops up. There's another this, there's a that, there's a new scheme, there's more money, there's LA, lots of taxes that have been earmarked for homelessness. And this is another one?
Well, I just wrote a column in which I call this Dr. Huckster's medicine show because it's the cure-all tonic for everything. Affordable housing. Are you worried about homelessness? Yes. Are you worried about there's no accountability? Yes. Well, this fixes it. Are you worried about people on the streets? Yes. This fixes it. This just fixes everything, including providing affordable housing for all of Los Angeles. Really, what is it? It's a doubling of the sales tax that was passed in 2017, Measure H, which was a 1/4% sales tax increase for homelessness services for 10 years. And it is expiring. They have this election and they have one more election to try and get it renewed. So, what are they doing? Is the Board of Supervisors putting this on the ballot after due consideration? No, because if they did that, it would require a 2/3 vote under the Constitution because it's a special tax. So, what are they doing? They're going through these outside groups which have collected signatures on petitions, and under a loophole from the Upland case, California Cannabis Coalition versus City of Upland, the California Supreme Court created a loophole with ambiguous language that said if a tax increase is put on the ballot by a citizens' initiative, it doesn't need a 2/3 vote. It only needs a simple majority. So they're rushing through that loophole, which, by the way, would be closed by the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act, which says 2/3 is 2/3 is 2/3, no matter how it gets on the ballot. So here they come with these petitions. They drove up in a truck to Norwalk, to, to the recorder's office with all of their petitions, and they probably have enough because they paid for signature collection, and it will be on the November ballot. Now, what does it do? It doubles the Measure H tax to 0.5%, and it makes it permanent. And where does the money go? Well, it goes to all the people who paid for the signature collection and are going to pay for the campaign. It goes to the SEIU local that represents government
No.
workers. Yes. It goes to the construction unions, which will be guaranteed the prevailing wage, which is the highest possible wage you can find for construction. So all these projects that are built with the money will be top dollar. You won't get very much for your money. That's how you get to your $700,000 a unit homeless
Yes.
housing. That's how you get there. And then it goes to all of these different service providers, which get the big contracts to provide the services at all these different facilities, and all the executives have six-figure salaries. That's where it goes. It is being directed to all of these groups that will get the money.
Isn't this what was it was the same story with the mansion tax?
Exactly the same. Exactly the same. Also trying to get through that Upland loophole, which it did, but it may not be legal. If the Upland decision is ever revisited by the Supreme Court, as the attorney for the taxpayers said today at the Supreme Court, that has never been resolved. It was created with ambiguous language. It was expanded by the appellate courts, pointing to the ambiguous language. It's still being contested. And it's not in the Constitution that there's a difference between a citizens initiative tax increase and the Board of Supervisors tax increase. They both have to go on the ballot. There's no reason to say that they have a different vote threshold for special taxes. But that's the current state of the law. And everybody's trying to rush through that loophole up and down the state with these so-called citizen initiative tax increases, which benefit the people who paid for the signature collection. What a racket.
Okay, so the mansion tax, that was LA County or city?
It's the city of Los Angeles, but it was a citizens initiative from all of the groups that get
All
the
these
money.
people. Right.
Right,
And now
same
they're back for more, as it were, with this one, which is county-wide, which is a lot of people.
Right.
10 million people also live in LA County.
Yes, and it's a sales tax increase. This is not a tax increase that you can say, oh, only rich people pay it or only
Yeah.
commercial realtors have to worry about it. No, this is a sales tax increase in these inflationary times when prices are going up, and sales tax is therefore going up right with them.
The corruption is just so stunning. Like, you get together. Oh, by the way, where does their money come from? You talk about these unions, if they paid, right? Their money comes from dues that they forcibly collect from
Exactly.
government workers that are paid by the taxpayer. Because
Exactly.
they put. I mean, that's a whole other conversation. But we now have is it the Janus ruling? Is that the right one?
Yes, it is.
Says that actually they can't you take dues from people if it's going to be used for political activity, but and you can object and take yourself out of that system. But I've spoken to people who are working to inform union members of their rights under that ruling. That was a federal Supreme Court ruling, and these unions put massive roadblocks in the way of that. They make it almost impossible. So they're collecting all this money in dues, and then they're spending it to enrich themselves further on the back of taxpayers. It's just extraordinary.
It's unbelievable. Instead of helping the homeless, what this measure would do is it would force the county to set up a quote labor council. I know you're well familiar with these. A labor council which will work for pay equity and I forget what else, but essentially unionizing the people who work for the service provider contractors. And then it also is funded by the building trades unions, which will benefit from this requirement that all these projects, even if they just rehab an old hotel, that's a public project. Everybody gets prevailing wage. It'll cost what, 40% more, 50%
There's so
more.
much of this that goes on that just doesn't. I
Right.
mean, honestly, I keep saying it, Susan. Thank goodness you keep an eye on it because, and you just think there must be in every city there's probably something like this going on.
There will be.
It's really depressing, isn't it? That's that. So that coming back to what we talked about earlier, your Taxpayer Protection Act would stop all this.
It would stop this citizens initiative tax increase loophole. It would say a special tax needs a 2/3 vote no matter how it gets on the ballot, which is what the Constitution says. But then you have this interpretation in this Upland case, which has been stretched into like a new form of taxation.
But then also they lie about what it is, right? They lie about in order to actually get the vote, whether
Yes,
it's 50% or 60, 2/3, they'll lie and say whatever, this will
right.
solve homelessness, but actually it doesn't. And you need to, but they're the ones that set it because it's these political people like that actually describe, get to write what's on the ballot, which is another scandal.
Yes, it is. And if it was done by the elected board of supervisors, they would have a little more restraint, I think, of the practicality of how it would be implemented, and they would be accountable to the voters. But once you have these independent groups that are writing it, they can ask for the moon and they can call it whatever they want, and they can try to ram it through with a simple majority, which is obviously easier to achieve than 2/3.
Who does write the language for these local ballot initiatives?
It's very opaque. We don't really know who writes it. I think there have been a lot of government officials who have been involved in this process of working through the negotiations of who's going to get what, who's going to provide the money for the campaign, who's going to get a provision here and a provision there. And it's 20 pages long, this tax increase, 20 pages to explain that they're doubling the Measure H tax and making it permanent. So you can see that everybody's got a little piece of what they want in order to contribute to the effort.
It's a really good reminder that basically over the years, because of the fact that you've had a weak Republican Party that just hasn't been there to challenge all this stuff, they've turned it into this absolutely just completely unconstrained kind of playground of corruption.
Yes.
Where the no scrutiny, the media doesn't really do a good job. I mean, you're there, we're there. Like generally, it's overall, it just doesn't get reported, and it's really shocking actually, and just to think that it's our beautiful state just being run in this just absolutely appalling way that reminds you of a kind of banana republic. It's just
It
awful.
it does. Now, in the case of this can be defeated. This is a sales tax increase. It is permanent. It can be defeated at the polls in Los Angeles County. It's just a question of informing the voters. It's been my experience that when you tell people that something is a tax increase, they hear it the first time, and you
Yeah.
don't have to send a mailer
And
every
we
2
saw it
days.
even with when they try and disguise it as a bond, which with the Prop One we just had, that
Right.
was a very close call, much to their surprise. When it's directly attacked, that's a different story. One other story, which is an interesting example of a fight back that was successful. This is in relation to housing. Tell us about that.
Well, in 2021, Senate Bill 9 was passed, which abolished single family zoning. It said that anywhere in the state, a lot split could take a single family lot, turn it into two homes, which each could have an accessory dwelling unit behind them. So four households on one lot without limitation by right. And even though there were a few little except if and only when kinds of provisions added at the last minute, essentially what this said was that you could quadruple the density of any single family lot anywhere in California, even in a gated community with CCRs and different covenants where you can't do it, you could do it. And this was challenged by 5 charter cities led by Redondo Beach. They said charter cities have, under the home rule doctrine of the Constitution, control over municipal affairs. And the state of California can only override that if it can cite a matter of statewide concern. So a matter of statewide concern would be, for example, you want to build a power plant that the whole state needs. A local government can't stop that because that's a statewide concern. But this, the statewide concern was said to be the need for affordable housing. And Senate Bill 9 has nothing in it that requires all these new units being built to be below market rates. So Redondo Beach and the others said, this is unconstitutional. You have said that this is about affordable housing, and that's the reason that you're overriding city control, but there's nothing in it about affordable housing. And a Superior Court just issued a ruling just recently in late April saying that's correct. This is nothing to do with affordable housing, and it is not rationally or reasonably related to affordable housing, and it impermissibly interferes with municipal affairs, and it is unconstitutional. So now this applies only to charter cities, and at the moment it applies only to the 5 charter cities that were in the lawsuit. A charter city is a city that has adopted its own constitution, and that's most of the large cities in California. There are 121 of them, including Los Angeles and San Francisco. But unless the Attorney General, Rob Bonta, who was sued in this case, unless he appeals the case, I think it only is going to apply to the 5 charter cities that sued. If he appeals and he loses, it applies to all charter cities.
That's an interesting twist to it. Thank you for explaining that so clearly. Why does it apply only? Why would it go broader only if he appeals?
That's a question for the lawyers. I don't know the exact reason that this lawsuit only applies to the cities that filed it. I guess it doesn't broaden out unless a higher court rules on it.
Interesting. So he may be tempted just to leave it and cut their losses, as it were.
Potentially. The governor's office would not comment. The attorney general's office said, they're going to defend SB 9 with everything they have, but they haven't done it yet.
And it does raise a really interesting question, because I'm very, I've always been a bit of a nerd for this. So I mean, back in the day in the UK, where power lies, and that idea of decentralized power, which I think is very much at the heart of the American idea. It's one of the reasons I love America. That's what the federal constitution is about, putting limits on power, making sure it's distributed, in a way that puts power in the hands of the people, we the people, etc. And so you have the 10th Amendment that to do that from the federal government to protect the states. And of course, that's been ignored the whole time that you've had this massive federal government centralization. At the state level, it's interesting. So, because as well as charter cities, we have charter counties, don't we?
Yes.
So that's in the Constitution.
Right.
And so you wonder why that isn't more of a feature of our political conversations in California, to just say, sorry, Sacramento, you can't do this. We're why we don't have more lawsuits. And, I mean, no one wants lawsuits for the sake of it. But, when you have have centralized government, whether that's Washington or Sacramento, encroaching on the rights of communities, I think it's incredibly important you stand up against that.
I think the reason we're seeing this conflict now is because we have this one party super duper majority. They have more than a two-thirds majority in each house, and the governor is very progressive. So they are pushing this stuff through, and they are running into resistance. In places like Orange County, in places like Redondo Beach, they are running into resistance from elected officials who in many cases are Democrats. But this is too far. And because they are pushing so hard and there's no break on them in Sacramento, in the political process, what you're seeing is the resort to the courts. And the courts are very progressive also. They rule consistently against taxpayers. It's a big concern. So then you have the ballot measures, where you go after these court decisions that have eroded the constitutional protections, and now they want to take the ballot measure off the ballot. So it's almost as if we are living under some sort of progressive authoritarian government, and if you don't like it, you can move out, and that seems to be their message.
I've said it many times. It's a kind of totalitarian mindset, which is that there's only one way of there's only one source of power, and it must be maintained and protected at all costs. The media echoes it, and if you deviate in any way, that's it's not just sort of a regular disagreement like this. You must be crushed. The other thing, I'll just leave it there, Susan. That was great. But I do want to make one point in relation to that last item, which is, okay, the actual lawsuit in this case related to housing. But the real story is about power and where it lies and taking power away from communities. And so the real point we have to make on housing is that while they're getting on their high horse about all these bills to push housing, whatever, the fundamental reason that housing is so unaffordable in California has nothing to do with these sorts of things. It's because of the other policies that they put in place, the environmental regulations, the labor situation. Just as you said, the fact that you've got all these, and actually those two to go together. We've talked about it in relation to our ballot initiative on housing that my organization, Golden Together, promoted, which was that 70% of lawsuits under the California Environmental Quality Act are used to block housing, but most of those are filed by unions in order to extract project labor agreements which insist on only using union members and workers or elevated salaries. That's the kind of thing that is the driver of the housing crisis, but they won't deal with them because it's their side that's pushing the extremism on the environment. I mean, we've talked about it before, the VMT, the vehicle mass travel, which is used to block housing in places that want housing. I mean, this is the crazy thing about housing is instead of endlessly kind of, forcing housing into communities that don't want it, why don't we allow the housing to be built in the places that do want it? And there are lots of places in California where they want to grow and expand. Some places inland in the Central Valley and so on. There's a lot. I've been there. I've been to communities where the leadership is utterly frustrated that all these environmental rules and other zoning things like VMT and whatever just say they can't build housing. Instead, it's all trying to be squeezed into the current development footprint. And I'll leave with the final point, which is that they say, well, it's all about you have to have density. You can't have suburbs and sprawl and all this. As if we already have one of the highest housing densities in the country. We have a tiny proportion of our land is developed in California. It's 5%. As my colleague Ed Ring at Golden Together has pointed out, he did the math. You could increase it to 6% and build single-family homes for 10 million people on quarter-acre lots. Now, I mean, no one's even asking for that. But, we've got plenty of room to build. We don't have to force it in the places that are already developed and who want to preserve the character of their neighborhood.
Exactly. And there's no reason to limit sprawl. There's no reason.
I know.
It's the climate. We don't have enough oil for commuting. None of that is valid. None of that justifies not building housing.
It's anti-human. I would say it's anti-Californian. It's a very, we have to end this war on the suburbs, this war on sprawl. It's ridiculous. It's California. People want to live in a way that they can enjoy our climate. Exactly. And that's great. And we should, and that's the dream. That's the California dream. That's why people come here.
Exactly.
And they're crushing it with this kind of ideology of density and scarcity, and everyone must live in apartments and take public transit and ride their bikes everywhere as if it's North Korea. It's just ridiculous.
It's so anti-human, as you said, and it needs to be exposed because people are fearful of some of these environmental claims. They say, oh, well, we're going to set the planet on fire if we build housing. No, we're not. And it needs to be exposed and it needs to be publicized that this is a false argument.
Exactly. Well, you and I are working hard on that. Susan, fantastic to see you as always. See you soon.
Thank you, Steve.
So here's something I want to get off my chest this week. Did you see the ridiculous videos of Mark Hamill, the actor? Of course, we loved him in Star Wars, but now he's just turned himself into this ridiculous political stooge running around in the White House and making these videos with Karine Jean-Pierre and Biden. And it's just so embarrassing because what it reveals is just how weak Biden is. Apparently they're making a movie. Steven Spielberg's shooting something for him. They're bringing out all the big guns, right? They're trying to save this absolute decrepit husk of a man, Biden, who clearly isn't fit to be president now, let alone for another 4 years. Everyone can see that. It is a total joke. He can barely speak. They're cutting short his speeches now. Even with a teleprompter, he can't get through it. So he was just, making a speech for Holocaust Memorial Day, barely a few minutes. You could just about get through it. I mean, everywhere you look, every aspect of the Biden presidency is just collapsing into this utterly humiliating puddle of total embarrassing nonsense. I mean, look at it. He can't speak. He can't campaign properly. He's being propped up by these movie stars. They're making films with him and about him. I mean, it's so embarrassing. And this is the guy that's supposed to be the leader of the free world. And then look at the consequences for policy. I mean, I don't want to go into all the different policy areas, but his completely disastrous handling of the situation in the Middle East, Ukraine, at the border, one thing after another. You don't know where he stands. He's constantly shifting around, pandering to his activists and the base, scrabbling around to try and, save his skin in the elections. You can see that the polls are telling him it's time to go. The Democrats see that. So instead of actually facing up to that and saying to this man, look, it's over. Everyone can see you're not fit to be president. You can barely do the job at all. They're propping him up in these pathetic ways that are just such an insult to the intelligence of every American. All right, everyone, that is our show for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you follow us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube. Tell everyone about the Steve Hilton Show. Tell everyone about the Big Ideas Book Club. I'm really enjoying the conversations we're bringing to you there. The latest one you can check out is with Alex Gladstein. It's an amazing learning experience for me, this conversation, because you may have heard me, if you've been following me for years, express total ignorance about the whole world of crypto and Bitcoin and all the rest of it. Well, I was really educated in this conversation, and it was completely different to what I thought it would be. I learned so much about the potential for Bitcoin in particular to put power in people's hands, to stand up against authoritarian regimes, to do all sorts of things that I had never imagined in a way that really fits with my worldview of exactly that, putting power in people's hands, decentralizing power. And I'd never really made those connections. And so I really loved this episode. And so please do check it out at Big Ideas Book Club. Make sure you tell everyone about that show as well. And we will see you back here soon for the next episode of The Steve Hilton Show.